So I've been a designer for nearly 40 years, either learning about it or practicing. And this particular quote behind me has significant meaning for me because I use visuals so much in my work. But this is the thing that is so important to all human beings because we visually process about 90% of the sensual information that we take in from the world around us. And it's very important that we understand that nature is our mentor that has educated us in this way. So I found in the process of being a designer that it is very much a collaboration between heart and head. Intuition and strategy have to work together to create good design. And all human beings have the desire to discover, to know, and then to create out of what we learn. So these are some examples of logos I've done in my career, and I've been primarily known as an identity designer. And balance is a very important component of good design in nature and in any type of design. One of the things I do is balance beauty with functionality. Design is not decoration. This is something that people have to understand. Design is describing the value of a certain function. So it's got a very value-related principle. There's also a fairly even divide between black and white, negative and positive space in my designs. And that's because scalability is a very important part of the structure of a logo that has to be able to be used on all sorts of medium. And finally, the design has got to create a relationship with the viewer. So part of my job is in creating a visual story. So in creating logos in particular, I found that I have to delineate what the essence of form is. I have to take in an immense amount of information and then determine what is the most important essential parts of that to help represent the client in the most relevant way. And what I found is that there are principles in nature, just really a handful of patterns, for instance, that create all of the incredible diversity all around us. And nature is tasked with doing just a few things with that energy. One thing it does is to move and distribute energy. So the branching pattern shown here in the way we normally see it in plant life, with veins that go through the leaves all the way through the branches of the tree to the trunk and out through the roots, is a very important way to visualize the pattern of moving and distributing energy from one place to another. As you'll notice, the visual looks very much exactly like what the process and the behavior is doing. Now, it's not only in plant life. Branching is all over the world and at all scales, including in our neural system that sends electrical impulses through our body to our blood circulation. And this is an example of a logo that I created for a client, a nonprofit at the University of New Mexico. Their acronym is ISTEC, which stands for the Ibero-Scientific Technology and Educational Consortium. So you can see they have to have an acronym. But I used the branching pattern as a basic template for this design because they are involved with bringing tech transfer technology companies from the United States into universities in Central and South America for the students to learn from. So they're very much in the middle of this process, and what the tech companies get out of that is the pick of the very best students that come from those programs. And so there is definitely this exchange of energy going on in human resources terms. Another thing I want to point out about this logo is I used Mayan iconography and Mayan glyphs to kind of inform the look of this design, because I very much wanted to recognize the sophisticated technologies that have existed before our current technology, which we always in the current era think that we have the biggest and the best and the brightest. But the Mayans, for example, they had a calendar that was accurate within seconds every year because they were so well informed about astrology and the cosmos and how everything was working together, whereas our Gregorian calendar, which is based on a line, has to be recalibrated every 4 years with a leap year, because time is not based on a line, it's based on a cyclical cycle. Another thing energy does is storing energy. So many components that make up physical space are created out of spherical or rod-shaped structures such as cells, molecules, viruses, those kinds of things. And when heat and pressure and gravity is introduced in three-dimensional space, they tend to collapse, filling all the gaps between. This is called a tessellating shape. It has no overlaps, no spaces. It's a perfectly functional space. This is also the basis of the idea of 6 degrees of separation, because in a lateral movement like this, it moves incredibly fast, connecting an amazing amount of things together at once on a two-dimensional plane. There's only 2 other shapes that do this in two-dimensional space. That is the square and the triangle. But bees know that the hexagon happens to hold just a little bit more honey and use just a little bit less wax than those other 2 shapes. So consequently, their hives are constructed out of that particular shape. Now you'll note that the number 6 runs all the way through the bee structure, from being a true insect with 6 legs to one of the basic molecules of honey being a 6-sided molecule, to the actual connectors on their epidermis being primarily 6-sided. Now this is a micrograph of an antenna, and that's actually curving around a 3-dimensional sphere or a space. So it mixes in very much like a soccer ball, pentagons, hexagons, and an occasional 4-sided character. But you can see that 6 is a dominant factor of this. So if you were thinking about a corporation or a company who was very concerned in presenting themselves as very stable and being able to store energy or a form of energy in a way that you could have easy access to, that was transparent, I'm wondering if anybody has an idea which industry would have a concern that they'd want to represent themselves in this way. Any ideas?
Yes, utilities.
That's good, yeah. It has to do with financial organizations, taxes, insurance, those kinds of things. They want to present themselves in a way of being very, very stable. And so consequently, banks and those types of corporations, the New York Stock Exchange, 4 corners. Goldman Sachs, 4 corners. So this is why you don't see spirals very often in these designs, because they're representing a very, very different thing. Now, money originally was based on an actual resource, the precious metal itself. And so they were typically minted in rounds, and their value was based on how much metal content, how much weight they actually had. So that changed a couple of 100 years ago when we started going into paper money. And this is what I grew up with in the 20th century primarily, this C note, which I'd like to point out that at 1971 we were taken off the gold standard. So we therefore had a paper currency created that didn't really have a backing behind it. So you go through a few decades of something like that, and this occurs. This is where the cultural symbolism begins to leak into the design. So can anybody detect here an obvious thing that's going on that was not present in the prior C note?
The ripple effect?
Ripple effect. Well, I'm looking primarily for the fact it's so obvious it's hard to see it. It's like breathing. You know, we do it every moment of every day, so we don't tend to pay attention to these things. But if you'll notice, Mr. Franklin has been offset significantly from the center. There's a reason for that. There is a significant imbalance that's going on right now in our financial system, as we're all very well aware of. This is the new C note. What you're looking at here are anti-counterfeiting measures, ironically. And also, a new part of this design is the inkwell that is holding the Liberty Bell. You can just barely discern it in this image, but it's holding the Liberty Bell within the inkwell. And they actually call this disappearing Liberty Bell. So, I mean, these are things that you watch in cultural symbolism and in the designs that we create, because it's very difficult for human beings to totally filter the truth. I mean, we really are not able to do that. Another thing that energy does, the third primary thing that I've identified as the general purposes of the work energy does in the universe, is connecting to other forms of energy. So this is seen in spirals, and also in things like the double helix. This is the basis of our genetic DNA. The helix is a slightly different version of the spiral, a sister, a cousin, you might say, with having the same diameter all the way down. This is because it is a very penetrating shape. It takes a lot of work to get the next blueprint, the next generation's blueprint into the future. And so it has to have a very purposeful sort of look to it. So it is realized in this idea of the double helix, which is actually two opposite things that have come together and begun to work together to create something new. This also works in very strong fabrics. It also works in cultures that survive over time. And this is a very recent image taken by NASA in 2006, very close to the center of our Milky Way galaxy by the black hole. This is called the Double Helix Nebula. And it's just fascinating to see how the scalability of these basic shapes filter through everything. And when you can match them up, in my profession as a designer and for when I teach other designers, because who wants to contribute to more of the junk information that's out there in the world? I want my students to go out there and create messages that actually have content, actually have value, that people can relate to with our first language being nature. And here is the more prevalent, more dominant spiral that we see in nature all the time, the logarithmic spiral, which spirals out from a center in a geometrically progressed shape. And you know, it's beautiful because it is actually addressing the future generations. This is what most people tend to see as a beautiful proportion, the phi proportion. And I'm going to show you the phi proportion in a couple of different versions. Here it is as a golden rectangle, and this is a Fibonacci phi, meaning it's created as a sequence of numbers that were discovered so long ago we don't know when it was discovered, but Fibonacci has taken credit for it, where you add 0 and 1, 1 and 1 make 2, 2 and 1 make 3, 3 and 2 make 5, and so on. And when you connect the actual circles that are derived from these numbers, just like that, at the points they intersect is where you connect them. And this is directly addressing our attraction, affiliation, and love of thinking of ourselves being progressed into the future through future generations. Now, the spiral and the star have a very intimate relationship with one another, and I'm going to show that to you right now. This is a regular pentagon star that has in one of the arms that same angled triangle rotating around to infinity within that arm that could just go on forever. So if you connect that, you have a squared off spiral, and when you add circles to it, there's the phi spiral again. So the spiral is throughout the human body. It's in the whorls of our fingertips, the whorls of hair on our head, very much an external or the more intimate view, I would say, of humanity, just like looking at a tree from different proportions. You can either see a tree as in profile with its branches in a very linear format, or if you look at a tree halved at the trunk, you see it as concentric rings. So all life encompasses both the point and the line. It's a part of what we are. But if you look at the human structure, we also have things that very much connect to the number 5. For instance, we have 5 appendages that extend off of our torso. And gentlemen, I'm speaking of the head for your benefit on that. We also have 5 senses that we dominantly use to understand the world around us. We have 5 fingers with which we create new things in our world, 5 toes with which we ambulate and move through space. So 5 is very much an important number to the human being. And we use it in all sorts of cultural sayings like 5-star hotels, 5-star generals. It's the very best, the creme de la creme. And interestingly to note, in the event, we have an event, and you happen to be in the right place at the right time, and trees and fruit and plants that create fruit are actually making food, note how many petals they have on their flowers. Most 5-petaled flowered fruiting plants create food that is compatible to our body. It's nutrition. And you should note too that 6- and 9-petaled things are poisonous typically, and or medicine. It is the same thing. Poison and medicine is only by dosage that makes the distinction. And in the center of the apple you also see the 5-pointed star. So emptiness is very much also a part of life. You have to have a container for anything to happen in physical space at all. So emptiness is not something that's used in advertising very much, particularly in the very push-pull world of information overload and consumerism that we live in right now. But it is very much a part of life being created at all. This is an embryo that is splitting into cells, and these cells know exactly where to go to create a blood cell, a bone cell, an organ, This is actually a fly embryo, so it's not making those things. But the process is the same for all life that's coming into being. The cells split up, they divide, they move to where they need to go. They need no consciousness to be able to do this. They're imbued with the intelligence of nature, and they know exactly what to do. So, got to have the container to create the space for life to occur. Now here's an example of one company that uses this principle of emptiness in their advertising. This is Muji from Japan. It was originated in Tokyo, but it is now all over the world. And as you can see, they have a philosophy of letting the customer come in the door and gravitate to whatever attracts them. They're not putting up sale signs, they're not telling you what is in which aisle. It's up to the consumer or the customer to go through and find what appeals to them. This is very much in line of that same process of emergence that occurs in life. So it lets the entity that's coming in do whatever it is they will do. Their print advertising very much follows along that line. This is an example of their kitchen shop selling spices. So, very, very minimalistic, very, very open-ended. However, what we see mostly, it was traditionally in the Western world. Now that we're globalized, it's everywhere. This is the kind of shopping experience that is hoisted upon most of us. We're called consumers, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to guess you feel like I do, that I do not want to be labeled by anybody, particularly a corporation, telling me who I am, because I came into this world with my own emergent properties, and I'm going to be whoever I'm going to be through the experiences I have in life, as it is meant to be. And their advertising, sort of heavy-handed, follows along in the same pattern. So this example I just showed you of the westernized mega buy consumerism type of thing is really more like a sign. It's directing you, it's telling you what to do. Now signs have their place, definitely, but that's when you're looking for an answer. And, or when you're being told an answer, what the ultimate goal and what you're being directed to do. Muji, on the other hand, is following an example of a symbol, which is we all have, two eyes in front of our head. We've all perceived the world around us in about the same way for as long as we've been around. And we can all see there's a negative and positive spaces here enclosed within the whole of the circle. And any human in the world would notice that, and they would interpret it in their own way, even though we're all seeing the same sort of thing. So the Muji advertising is much more following along in line with asking you a question. What do you feel about this? How are you going to put yourself into the world? So we're designed as human beings to balance our intuition with our brain. We're designed to balance our creativity with our strategy, the two hemispheres of our brain. We're designed to balance the two hemispheres of the world. This is the only way that things can work. We all live here together. And if you listen to your heart and remember what you know, and then contribute yourself out of intention, that's what we're all here to do. Thank you very much.